Everyone, this is Mr. P here with our lesson number 10. I hope you all are doing well. I miss you for sure, and I hope you're enjoying our study of the Civil Rights Movement. And lesson number 10 here is on the sit-ins. So we're going to be discussing their success and significance. Before you finish this video or after you finish it, depending on what you prefer, make sure you check out this article on the Greensboro sit-in and this documentary on from Eyes on the Prize on the Nashville sit-in to help you complete the second row of your nonviolent organizing campaigns of the Civil Rights Movement organizer. So let's jump into it. All right. So here we have important to understand the conditions of oppression here are that try to address our segregated lunch counters. Lunch counters were folks could get food while they were shopping. They were often in areas where people in shopping malls and whatnot. Therefore, they demanded that these lunch counters be desegregated, and this launched a wave of these campaigns. So this is a collection of campaigns. There's about 60 of them. And the leaders were largely students. Historically, Black colleges and universities had a lot of students who were building their political consciousness, their race consciousness. And in February of 1960, these folks here, Frank Kane and his friends, were discussing, prior to that, they were discussing Gandhi, strategies to fight back, to regain a sense of dignity. And they decided to sit in at the local lunch counter to demand that they be served, with dignity. And the students then got a lot of support, especially in Nashville, from people like Diane Nash and James Lawson Jr. of CORE, Congress for Racial Equality, who ended up training a lot of students, not just in Nashville, but in other cities where these sit-ins spread, to get ready for nonviolent action, right? If one's going to sit in, the important thing is to not respond by fighting back, even if food gets dumped on them, even if racial slurs are hurled at them. So this was a wave of sit-ins. So there were about 60 locations, 13 states over a period of a few months, and there were over 50,000 students who participated. They also paired this with a variety of other strategies, including consumer boycotts, picketing, and I want to focus on jail no bail for a moment. They intentionally knew that they were going to get incarcerated, arrested, and put in jail for sitting in and violating the law. So they would have waves of students, right? First wave would sit down, get arrested. Second wave would sit down. The goal was to try and get the jail so full and no one would pay bail. So it would cost the county, money to house them in jail. And this would then put pressure and create a crisis where, the option is then to desegregate the lunch counters. This video, which I hope you pause, go to the slides and watch, interviews Frank McCain, leader of the Greensboro sit-in, and he talks about this moment where the police officer is walking up and down, not knowing what to do with them sitting there at the lunch counter violating the law because they're not doing anything violent. And I think it really illustrates this Dr. King quote really well. So if you check out this Dr. King quote, he says, "Now, I can assure you that if we rose up in violence in the South, our opponents would really know what to do because they know how to operate on this level. They control all the forces of violence, but nonviolence confounds, i.e. confuses the oppressor. If he beats you, you develop the power to accept it without retaliating. If he doesn't beat you, fine. If he throws you in jail in the process, you go there and transform the jail from a dungeon of shame to a haven of freedom. The oppressor ends up frustrated. This is the power of nonviolence." Now, later we will discuss Malcolm X's critique of nonviolent strategy, although he does end up using it himself later in his life. He critiques it, though, because he believes it is kind of just allowing oneself to be beat, this passive turn the other cheek. But as Dr. King, as Bayard Rustin, as Ella Baker, as many other practitioners of nonviolence argued, this is an active strategy to fight back. The state has the power of the military and the police. To use violence, one would surely die. And to use nonviolence, one would surely get, beaten up and arrested for sure. But Dr. King's argument here is that it confuses them, just like that police officer didn't know what to do with Frank McCain. Frank McCain used violence, police officer would have automatically used violence, but he didn't know what to do with this nonviolent strategy. So nonviolence is an active, not a passive, but an active strategy to try and confuse those in positions of power and to put pressure on them: economic pressure, political pressure, media pressure, moral pressure too, although not always, to get them to change. I want to make sure we understand, however you fall on what kind of strategy, self-defense, violence, nonviolence, we want to understand each strategy from the perspective of those who are practicing it. And then we can understand the critiques too. So the sit-ins did lead to some repressive violence. Not at Greensboro. I've never read any accounts of repressive violence at Greensboro, but at Nashville, people were attacked and thrown off the seats. So there were violent physical attacks at some of these locations. The Eyes on the Prize documentary does talk about some of them. And you can see here that next to some Black students sitting in, there were white students who also sat in and received some of those violent attacks as well. There were white allies who did some of these sit-ins alongside Black folks doing these sit-ins. Important to recognize. When evaluating the success of the campaign, you want to take a look here at the wave, right? So there's a mass wave in February and March, and sit-ins continue at various locations throughout the next year. And so it launches a wave, and many of these sit-ins were successful. All the plus signs are, where there were sit-ins that led directly to desegregation of the lunch counters. The empty circles are ones that were not successful. So I don't have an exact count here, but you can tell that by glancing that more, it looks like, there were more successful sit-ins than unsuccessful ones. It's also important to recognize that all the stars were segregated lunch counters with no sit-ins. So sometimes, a sit-in was not necessary, and these lunch counters were persuaded by the experience of sit-ins in other locations. It's also important to recognize when evaluating the success that there was a wave of boycotts and pickets in the northern stores. So Woolworths is a company north and south. In the south, their lunch counters did not serve Black folks, customers. In the north, they served Black customers, but they didn't hire Black workers. In the South, sometimes they even hired Black workers, actually. The desegregation or the segregation was at the customer level. So in the North, they wanted the stores to hire Black workers, so they boycotted some of these stores. And this is actually a shot from Philadelphia. We don't pay, or we don't buy where we can't work. That's a consumer boycott. So some of these northern stores did end up hiring Black workers. The sit-ins also led to a formation of a new organization called Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, led by students, largely from HBCUs. And this was launched. This is a photo from the launch meeting, which was organized by Ella Baker. Now, I'm going to resist going into detail on Ella Baker right now because I'm going to release a video about her, Dr. King, and Malcolm X later on in preparation for our seminar, our virtual seminar on the three of them. So for now, I'll just say she, born in North Carolina, went to Shaw University, actually, HBCU, went north to Harlem, worked with a lot of co-op organizing for, Black-owned businesses, worked for the NAACP, worked for Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And when SNCC was founded, they were going to join the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Dr. King and Reverend Abernathy's organization. But Ella Baker said, don't join SCLC. Stay separate. Don't be a youth league of an adult organization. Be your own organization so you can make independent decisions. Ella Baker has a lot of critiques of Dr. King's organizing, and she wanted to make sure that the students had autonomy to make their own decisions. And so SNCC becomes a separate organization, which helps them a lot. And they differ a lot in their leadership structure. You can just see in this photo here, very different from some of the, if you compared it to Dr. King giving a speech from the pulpit, the structure was much more group-oriented, group-centered, more college-age youth, less male-dominated. There was a way in which it still had some male-dominated aspects to it, but much less so than than SCLC, which the Southern Christian Leadership Conference formed after Montgomery bus boycott, was very male-dominated, to the point where when Dr. King was trying to hire an executive director because someone had just left, a preacher had just left because he couldn't do the SCLC job and the his preaching job at his church. Ella Baker, who had been working for a long time with them, was hired as just as an interim, and she was highly qualified, one of the most skilled organizers of her day. But they refused to hire her full time, and they hired another man instead, who she actually was asked to help hire. They never gave it to her job because they never saw a woman leading SCLC. So there were ways in which sexism infiltrated the movement, right? Especially SCLC. Less so with SNCC. So this summarizes a lot of what we just talked about in terms of the, evaluating success, in terms of the wave that was launched, the creativity in their tactics like jail no bail, demonstrating the power of college-age students leading to the formation of an organization. It didn't just lead to desegregation, Woolworth desegregating all their lunch counters. It did do that. It also led to new organizational growth, and that is another way to measure the success of a movement, not just by did it meet its goals, but did the movement grow? And it certainly did. So next week, we'll talk about the Freedom Rides. I hope you can join me for our Freedom Ride video, and I look forward to our discussion this week. Take care. Bye.